December 19th, 1944. Near the village of Stupidest, Belgium, third day of the German Ardennes offensive. An Obersturmbannführer named Joachim Peiper sat in the turret of his lead tank and looked at a map that had stopped meaning anything useful roughly 6 hours earlier. Peiper commanded the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division's armored battle group, the most aggressive, most heavily armed, and most carefully chosen formation in the entire German offensive. His orders were simple in their ambition and almost impossible in their execution. Drive west, cross the Meuse River, and keep moving until the entire Allied position in Belgium and northern France began to unravel. For 3 days, his column had moved with a speed that recalled the Blitzkrieg years of 1940, smashing through American positions, capturing prisoners and equipment, advancing further and faster than almost any other unit in the offensive. And now, 6 hours after his lead tanks had reached the outskirts of Stupidest, Peiper's battle group had stopped. Not because American resistance had finally organized itself into something his Panthers and King Tigers could not overcome, though that resistance was real and growing by the hour. His column had stopped because a meaningful percentage of his vehicles, including some of the most powerful tanks in the entire German arsenal, were sitting by the side of the road with their fuel gauges reading empty. Peiper had known before the offensive even began that this moment was coming. The German plan for the Ardennes offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, later associated in popular memory with the term Battle of the Bulge, had been built around an assumption so fragile that several senior officers had voiced concerns about it during planning, concerns that had been acknowledged and then overruled by a high command desperate enough to gamble anyway. The assumption was that German forces, advancing rapidly through American lines, would capture American fuel depots largely intact, and that this captured fuel would supply the offensive's later stages because Germany's own fuel reserves, by December 1944, were not sufficient to sustain a major mechanized offensive to its planned objectives using German fuel alone. Peiper had captured some American fuel during his advance. He had also discovered, at several points, that retreating American units had successfully destroyed fuel stocks before his column arrived, or that the depots his intelligence had identified contained far less fuel than the offensive's planners had assumed would be there. He sat in his turret outside Stupidest and did the arithmetic that the entire German high command had been avoiding since the planning stages, and the arithmetic was simple and brutal. His battle group did not have enough fuel to reach the Meuse. It had perhaps enough fuel to reach the next town. After that, the offensive that depended on his column's speed and momentum would be reduced to the speed of men walking, because the tanks that had carried it this far would be sitting motionless in the Belgian snow. Hold that thought. Because what Joachim Peiper was calculating in his tank turret on December 19th, 1944, was not a tactical setback. It was the moment the entire strategic logic of Germany's last major offensive of the war collapsed under its own arithmetic. An arithmetic that German planners had understood with total clarity months before the first shell was fired, and had chosen to gamble against anyway because the alternative was admitting the war was already lost. To understand why German tanks were running on captured American gasoline in the Ardennes forest in December 1944, you need to understand the condition of Germany's fuel supply by the autumn of that year. And the condition was, in the most literal sense, catastrophic. Germany's wartime economy had depended heavily on synthetic fuel production, a sophisticated chemical process that converted coal into usable petroleum products, developed specifically because Germany possessed abundant coal reserves, but almost no domestic oil fields of its own. By 1944, this synthetic fuel industry, concentrated in a relatively small number of large industrial plants across Germany, had become one of the most heavily targeted systems in the entire Allied strategic bombing campaign. American and British bombers, following an intelligence assessment that correctly identified German fuel production as a uniquely vulnerable choke point, conducted a sustained campaign throughout 1944, specifically targeting synthetic fuel plants, oil refineries, and fuel storage depots. The results were measurable in numbers that German wartime planners tracked with mounting alarm. German synthetic fuel production, which had reached its wartime peak in early 1944, fell by more than two-thirds over the following months, as the bombing campaign systematically destroyed production capacity faster than German engineers working desperately to repair and rebuild damaged facilities could restore it. By the autumn of 1944, Germany's fuel situation had deteriorated to the point where frontline combat units were experiencing fuel shortages that affected basic training, routine vehicle maintenance, and even tactical mobility in ongoing defensive operations, well before any consideration was given to launching a major new offensive. This is the strategic environment in which Adolf Hitler, against the explicit advice of several of his most experienced field commanders, ordered the planning of a major counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, aimed at recapturing the psychological and strategic initiative Germany had lost since the Normandy invasion, by driving a wedge between American and British forces and potentially forcing a separate peace that would allow Germany to concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviet advance in the east. The offensive's planners, including senior officers who privately doubted its feasibility, faced an impossible arithmetic problem from the earliest planning stages. The offensive, to achieve its objectives, required moving large mechanized formations, tanks, armored personnel carriers, supply trucks, across considerable distances, through difficult winter terrain, at a tempo that demanded enormous fuel consumption. Germany's actual fuel reserves, calculated by the Army's own logistics staff, were sufficient to support perhaps the first several days of the planned advance, calculated against optimistic assumptions about weather, terrain, and the pace of advance. Beyond that point, the plan depended entirely on capturing American fuel stocks intact and in sufficient quantity to refuel the advancing columns and allow the offensive to continue toward its ultimate objective, the Belgian port city of Antwerp, whose capture would have denied the Allies their most important supply port in northwestern Europe. This dependency on captured enemy fuel was not a minor logistical assumption buried in a planning annex. It was the central strategic premise the entire offensive rested on, and several senior German officers said so explicitly during the planning process, in language that survives in post-war interviews and captured planning documents. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army in the offensive, later described the fuel situation as the single greatest weakness in the entire operational plan, a weakness he and other commanders had raised during planning conferences, only to be told, in effect, that the offensive would proceed regardless, because Hitler had determined that Germany's strategic position required a dramatic gamble, and that conventional logistics caution was a luxury the Reich's situation in December 1944 no longer afforded. This produced an offensive plan with a built-in contradiction that historians have returned to repeatedly in the decades since. An attack whose success depended on speed and continuous forward momentum, fueled by an assumption capturing intact American fuel depots on a predictable schedule that depended on factors entirely outside German control. The Americans, after all, had their own doctrine for handling exactly this scenario, and it was not a doctrine that favored leaving fuel conveniently available for an advancing enemy. American logistics units, when German forces approached fuel and supply depots during the early days of the offensive, generally followed standard procedure: evacuate what could be moved and destroy what could not be evacuated in time, denying the advancing enemy exactly the resource the German plan most desperately needed. This was not a brilliant tactical innovation specifically designed to counter the German fuel gamble. American commanders, in the chaos of the first days of the offensive, often did not have detailed intelligence about how dependent the German advance actually was on captured fuel. It was simply standard doctrine, the same systematic denial of resources approach this channel has documented in other contexts, applied here with consequences that proved far more significant than anyone on either side fully appreciated in the moment. The specific moment this strategic vulnerability became an operational catastrophe in a way that is well documented in both German and American after-action records occurred at a series of fuel depots near the Belgian town of Stavelot, which Piper's battle group captured largely intact on December 18, 1944. A moment that, for a brief period, appeared to validate the entire German planning assumption. The depot at Stavelot contained a substantial quantity of fuel, by some post-war estimates, more than 1 million gallons of gasoline stored in jerry cans and bulk containers, enough fuel that capturing it intact represented exactly the kind of windfall the German offensive's planners had bet the entire operation on. For a matter of hours, Piper's forces controlled access to fuel reserves that could have meaningfully extended his battle group's operational reach toward the Meuse River, the offensive's critical objective. What happened next illustrates, in painfully literal terms, the difference between the German offensive's desperate, schedule-driven momentum and the kind of patient, systematic logistics planning this channel has documented as a recurring American advantage throughout the war. Piper's forces, under enormous pressure to maintain the speed of advance that the entire offensive's strategic logic depended on, did not have time to fully secure, organize, and distribute the captured fuel through their own logistics system in the methodical way that might have maximized its tactical value. American forces, meanwhile, regrouping after the initial shock of the German advance, identified the captured depot as a critical target and subjected it to artillery fire and air attack specifically aimed at denying its continued use to the German column, destroying or rendering inaccessible a significant portion of the fuel before Piper's forces could fully exploit the windfall that had, for one brief moment, appeared to solve the entire offensive's central logistics problem. By December 19th, the same day Piper sat in his tank turret outside Stoumont doing the arithmetic that would define the rest of his battle group's campaign, the captured fuel that had briefly promised to extend the offensive's reach had been substantially neutralized, and Piper's column found itself in exactly the position German planners had warned against, and German high command had gambled past anyway. A powerful, aggressive armored formation deep in enemy territory, with momentum that depended entirely on a fuel supply that simply was not there in the quantities the plan required. The consequences of this fuel crisis cascaded through the rest of the offensive in ways that historians studying the Battle of the Bulge have traced in granular detail. German armored columns across multiple sectors of the front, not just Piper's battle group, began experiencing the same arithmetic failure within days of each other, as the optimistic fuel consumption estimates built into the original plan collided with the reality of winter terrain, American demolition of bridges and roads that lengthened actual travel distances beyond planned routes, and the simple fact that captured American fuel was consistently less available in practice than German planning assumptions had projected. Tanks that ran dry did not simply stop and wait for resupply that was not coming. In many documented cases, they were abandoned by their crews, fully functional, combat-capable vehicles, some of them among the most formidable armored fighting vehicles fielded by any nation during the entire war, simply left motionless beside roads and in forest clearings, because the fuel required to move them another mile did not exist anywhere within the German logistics network's actual reach. American forces, advancing in the weeks following the offensive's culmination and eventual collapse, captured a meaningful number of intact, undamaged German tanks, vehicles that had never been defeated in combat, that had simply run out of the one resource no amount of crew skill, vehicle quality, or tactical brilliance could substitute for. This is the detail that distinguishes the Ardennes fuel crisis from a simple logistics shortfall and elevates it to one of the more instructive case studies in the entire war about the relationship between strategic ambition and logistical reality. Germany's tank crews in the Ardennes were not by any measure less skilled or less courageous than they had been earlier in the war. Germany's tank designs, the Panther, the King Tiger, remained, by most technical assessments, among the most capable armored vehicles fielded by any combatant nation in 1944. None of that mattered once the fuel gauge reached zero, because a tank without fuel is not a weapon. It is simply an expensive, heavily armored object sitting in the snow, waiting for whichever army eventually arrives to claim it. The broader strategic consequence of the fuel crisis extended well beyond the tactical embarrassment of abandoned tanks. The German offensive's entire operational tempo, its ability to maintain the speed and continuous pressure that gave it any chance of reaching the Meuse River and beyond before American and British forces could organize an effective response, depended on sustained mechanized momentum. Once that momentum stalled, sector by sector, as fuel-starved columns slowed and then stopped, the offensive lost the one advantage that might have offset Germany's overall numerical and material inferiority on the Western Front by December 1944. Speed and surprise. American and British forces, given the additional days that the German fuel crisis effectively granted them, were able to reorganize, reinforce threatened sectors, most famously around the besieged town of Bastogne, and begin the methodical process of containing and then reversing the German advance. By late December, the offensive that had opened with genuine shock and genuine territorial gains had been reduced to a fighting withdrawal, with German forces retreating back toward their starting positions, having expended substantial reserves of men, equipment, and remaining fuel in an operation whose central strategic premise had been built on an assumption that German planners themselves had identified as fragile before the first shot was fired. The numbers, tallied in the operation's aftermath, tell their own story. Germany committed some of its last significant reserves of trained manpower and modern armored vehicles to the Ardennes offensive, resources that, once expended in a failed gamble, could not be replaced at anything approaching the rate Germany's deteriorating industrial base required. The Western Allies, while suffering significant casualties of their own in the offensive's opening days, retained the industrial and logistical depth to absorb the shock and continue their advance toward Germany within weeks of the offensive's collapse. The Ardennes gamble had been Germany's last opportunity to fundamentally alter the war's trajectory in the West, and it had failed. Not primarily because German soldiers fought poorly or because German equipment performed inadequately, but because the entire plan had been built on an arithmetic of captured fuel that German planners had known from the earliest stages was unreliable, and had proceeded anyway because the strategic desperation of Germany's overall position by December 1944 had made even a fragile gamble seem preferable to the alternative of doing nothing at all. Joachim Peiper survived the Battle of the Bulge, extracting the remnants of his battle group on foot after abandoning the last of his fuel-starved vehicles, having lost the overwhelming majority of the armor he had commanded just days earlier at the height of his advance. He continued serving in the German army until the war's end, was captured by American forces, and was later controversially convicted and then released in connection with war crimes committed by his unit during the offensive, a separate and complicated post-war legal history that exists alongside but is distinct from the purely operational story of his battle group's fuel crisis. He was killed in 1976 in France, in circumstances that remain debated, decades after the war that had defined the most consequential days of his military career. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who had warned his superiors before the offensive began that the fuel plan represented the operation's single greatest weakness, survived the war and gave extensive post-war interviews and testimony to American and British military historians compiling accounts of the German side of the Ardennes campaign. He consistently identified the fuel situation in interview after interview as the decisive factor that had doomed the offensive from its planning stages. Not a failure of German soldiers, not a failure of German equipment, but a strategic decision made at the highest level to gamble an entire offensive on a logistics assumption that the Army's own planning staff had flagged as unreliable before a single tank crossed the start line. The abandoned tanks themselves, Panthers and King Tigers, among the most formidable armored vehicles of the entire war, captured intact in the snow with empty fuel tanks, were recovered by American forces in the weeks following the offensive's collapse. Some were studied for intelligence purposes. Some were eventually scrapped. A handful survive today in museum collections, displayed as examples of German wartime armor, the placards beside them rarely mentioning the detail that mattered most about how that particular vehicle came to be sitting in an American museum rather than fighting its way to the Meuse. It was never destroyed in combat. It simply ran out of gas in a forest in Belgium in the last days of December 1944. The victim, not of an American shell, but of an arithmetic problem its own commanders had warned about and its own high command had decided to ignore. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you. That is over 13 minutes of real history, and it means something that you are still here. If this reached you, if the story of an offensive that failed on its own logistics rather than on the battlefield alone deserves to be remembered and understood, hit the like button. It is the single most effective thing you can do to help this story find the people who care about it. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit subscribe and the bell, and you will not miss the next one. I would love to know where you are watching from today. Leave it in the comments. And if someone in your family served in the Battle of the Bulge, on either side, in any role, tell us about them. These stories survive because people like you keep passing them forward. Thank you.